Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm greeting you with a sort of somewhat halo-ish effect going on. I can't quite get this lighting right today, or ever really, as you may have noticed from anyone who's ever watched any of my videos. So there we go. Anyway, I thought it'd be really interesting to follow up on a tag that I was just tagged in by Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot even, that's their name. There we go. And if you've not checked them out before, please do. They are two wonderful, wonderful people who, I think something I really appreciate about their videos is not only their kind of thoughtfulness when considering books themselves, and also their ability to completely trash a book if they hate it, love it, but also just their general awareness and kind of carefulness in really thinking about some of these issues in a more detailed way, and actually being bold and brave enough to start some of these conversations, or at least kind of encourage other people to be part of these kinds of conversations. And this is exactly one such one. Looking at the idea of cancel culture. Now this is a widely used term, and there's a prompt later where it sort of will be up to the kind of person doing the tag to kind of try and define what it means for them. But before we do that, let's first tag people. So I think part of this prompt is also to try and tag people who you think might have different or opposing or interesting views about some of these things. I have a few people in mind who I think I'd really love to hear the thoughts of. So firstly, AJ Dunn reads and writes. Their ideas on things are often really, really interesting, and I'd really love to hear what they say. Also, I would like to say Larry has opinions. He has opinions. Let's hear them about this topic. I would also love to hear Daniel over at Guilty Feet having a little go at this. I think he'd also have some really, really interesting things to say about this. And I'd also say Ms. Reads a Lot, I think, would also be a really interesting perspective on this. So let's go with that to start us off. But to kind of go into the main part of this, and second prompt itself, what is cancel or call out culture? And people have really different opinions on this. And it's worth me saying probably at the beginning of this that please don't take my definition to be the one and only. I don't think anyone would. I don't think I'm any kind of authority on anything, but you know, this is sort of how I see it as being. And it's also worth sort of saying as part of this, as part of, you know, what call out culture or cancel culture or whatever is, I'm also really happy to be challenged on these things. And so if you sort of disagree with my ideas or my thoughts on this, please do respectfully in the comments have a go at me about it. But anyway, so I see personally, I see cancel culture or call out culture as being a way of really reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, what you've done is not acceptable, what you've said is not acceptable. And I think Gunpowder, blood crikey. Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot, which apparently I can never say despite being a Brit, and the fact that, like, you know, the whole, this is based on the whole, you know, their name is based on all of the 5th November stuff. I should be able to do this a little bit more easily. So let's start that again. Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot, which I'm going to say very, very slowly, gave really, really interesting thoughts on this, and I really highly recommend that you check out their video on this. I think they are so thoughtful and interesting in how they talk about this very nuanced discussion, and I think they also don't let themselves off the hook in that sense as well. They don't sort of treat it as if they are kind of, you know, God's kind of looking down and kind of saying, like, we've got this sussed. What I really love about their channel is their real openness to learning and to sort of saying, actually, I don't really have all the answers, or I don't fully know this, I want to find out more. And I think that's what's so brilliant about this tag and about them, is having that conversation about all of it. So I see cancel culture as part of that, of sort of saying, hey, this is not okay. Here are my thoughts on this. Here's why I think what you've done is maybe harmful or problematic. And I think words like problematic get kind of short shrift, where a lot of people think it's kind of academies for, like, I don't like this. But I think there is something a lot more behind it, because I think calling something problematic is not to kind of instantly say, you know, like, get out of my sight as such. It's kind of saying, actually, there is a problem, let's work together to solve it in some way. Or you know, here's the problem I had with it. And I think for me, cancel culture is often about the idea of saying, no, this stops here. Part of my thinking around this is also influenced by Brené Brown, who I absolutely love. Her writing about, gosh, what's happening here? Writing about vulnerability and about the power of being really open to kind of learning and kind of acknowledging a bit about who you are, I think is really great about this. And I listened to a really fascinating podcast by her talking about how often when we try to cancel, and again, it's a loaded term, but when we try to cancel people, she kind of objects firstly to the idea that a person can be cancelled. A person still has agency in a life. We might be cancelling various aspects of their career, we might be doing whatever else, but there's a lot of shame that's bound up in that idea. And so her whole thinking, and this kind of comes on to the next prompt about whether it's a positive or negative force, is to kind of say, actually, just shaming people about various things doesn't always work and is often quite damaging. I can think of a few examples of people in the UK who, once they've faced backlash and shame, almost retreat further and further back into their position. And they become much less willing to have any of that discussion. I don't really want to mention some of their names. I think it's going to, if you're a British person who's ever been on Twitter, they may be fairly easy people to guess. But a few people who, for example, stated quite transphobic views, and then when challenged, doubled down. The fact, actually, you know what's really bloody horrible about what I just said, actually, really, is the fact that I said somebody being transphobic and doubling down on their views, and it's not immediately obvious who that person is. That's grim, actually, isn't it? Like, the more you step back and think about that, that's incredibly grim, that there are many active transphobes with platforms who are not really seeing repercussions. Horrible, horrible stuff. Anyway, but what's really interesting is people who have sort of been shamed in that way, often they've lost everything. I can think of a TV writer in the UK who sort of his marriage failed and he lost most of his friends, and even members of his family weren't talking to him anymore because of his transphobic views. I'm not saying that we should sort of feel sorry for him in that sense. He brought that on himself and he sort of really doubled down that position even when given a chance to kind of come back from it. But I think what really troubled me about that is thinking, but where does he go now? If he's lost everything, there's nothing left to lose, and he's probably going to become even more vitriolic and sort of vituperative in those opinions. So, I mean, again, don't really feel any sympathy for him for actively causing harm to and violence towards people. But at the same time, I'm kind of fascinated by what that then means. What's the end game for people after that point? And sort of following on from that, the prompt also kind of talks about the idea of that within the booktube, bookstagram, bookish community as a whole, and whether that can be positive or negative. And I think this kind of comes up a bit, I'm going to sort of merge this in prompt 8, which is about kind of power imbalance and sort of whether, you know, size of audience or whatever. Myself as a relatively small booktuber, I'm not sure if me kind of having a crusade against any book would make any difference, but I think it's really worth noting what Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot, did it right that time, said about this, that, you know, there are two really interesting parts of that even a person with a small platform, firstly, they may eventually grow and have a bigger platform, and secondly, influence, as much as I sort of hate that term provided with this sort of thing, they kind of compared it to sort of being like somebody talking about something in a pub, or, you know, when you meet up with a friend over a meal or something, and that can have a sort of slow effect. So I think there's a really interesting thing to be said there about, you know, power and influence in that sense. But I think this is often what gets misused and sort of spoken about when we talk about things like cancel culture, is the idea that someone like J.K. Rowling is at all cancelled. Her last book, despite the vile transphobia that she had been spewing before the book came out, and despite the fact that the book purposely courted some of that drama by having themes, or at least the promotion around the book seemed to hint at something very J.K. Rowling opinion about the book. Despite that, the book still sold incredibly well, perhaps less well than some of her other books, and there were definitely people sort of just giving it 1 star on Goodreads straight out without having read it. But I don't think she was necessarily cancelled. She still sold very, very well. She still got more than enough money to basically retire and just, you know, have expensive art fairs at her home, or like, I don't know, buy several yachts if she really wanted to. I'm really quite angry at the fact that she decided that the best use of her time was transphobia, but there we go. But I think this is where it becomes quite interesting, because that power imbalance is a really vital part of this puzzle. Are we punching up? Are we punching down? I think in the same way that if I had a relatively large platform and I was dunking on some kind of author for their views, I think it would come across as being quite mean, even if the heart of what I was challenging them over was right, or at least I felt so. And again, that's the part of this, right? There's so much that's sort of subjective to some parts of this, where somebody might say, actually, you know, I was supporting my friend who happens to be being a transphobe, as opposed to I was being actively transphobic. I would argue that you're still enabling that entire system, and that harm to people. But, you know, you can also see why someone would want to jump to the defense of their friend, even if their friend had terrible opinions. So I think this is really difficult, essentially, is what I'm saying from all of this. And I'll use this to finally go on to the prompts again. As a prompt for from mixing fabrics to involuntary cannibalism. This prompt is brilliant. What transgressions would you boycott an author over? And I think this is the really important part. It's difficult when you think of what that means for authors who are already dead versus living authors who are still writing now and who would still sort of get the financial benefit of that. You know, people pointing out kind of historical issues with some writers, it's really important. But I think I do maybe approach that differently, because the money is perhaps going to the estate of that person rather than me knowing that it's going directly to them. And it's not obviously just about the money, but that is an important part of the power of this. And I think it's quite complicated when the author is still alive, and it's, you know, I don't really want to give a boost to a career of someone who is doing active harm. Again, that fine line on where they commit harm is really difficult. Like, that's nuanced, and as much as it doesn't always, you know, it's tough, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. All of this boils down to, this is a very difficult conversation, but I'm trying to sort of very carefully think about how I actually feel about this. And this comes to the fifth prompt. What does boycott mean to you? Not buy, not read, not promote, or 3, how do you boycott, and does this depend on the transgression or the offence? So, for example, there is, you know, J.K. Rowling, as an author, to kind of come back to this, I really enjoyed the Harry Potter books as a kid, have had no real desire to go back and read them, or particularly watch the films since. You know, it had its time, it was great. I don't really feel like I necessarily need it in my life, but it's worth noting that Harry Potter, for many people, was a really big thing. It was, you know, it really bookended their childhood, no pun intended, and it was a really pivotal part, particularly for someone who kind of people roughly my age. So I was basically the age of the Harry Potter characters as the books were coming out, if that makes sense. So I was roughly the same age as the characters at pretty much all of the junctures, or kind of per book sort of thing. And so I can see how that would have meant a lot to certain people, and then to have J.K. Rowling do what she did, and obviously it's not just her, but I can see how that would feel particularly harmful and hurtful. But at the same time, you know, as much as I enjoyed those books at the time, I have no desire, even if I'd really loved them, to really go back. I think it would taint it too much, and I would feel complicit in some form if I were to be actively promoting her books or buying them, or what have you. This also comes up, and I mentioned this sort of a few of the comments, and had a little chat with Gunpowder Fiction and Plot about this on their video, of just kind of thinking about what that also means for someone who has reading goals like my own, which involve prizes. What does that mean when, for example, an author who is causing harm is on a short list or a long list of a prize, particularly something like the Booker? Do you read it and not, you know, do you get it from the library, so you kind of limit the amount that you're giving to them in kind of financial terms? Do you refuse to read it? Do you steal it? Do you, you know, do you just borrow it from a friend? If you do read it, do you rate it on things like Goodreads? Do you talk about it? This came up with last year's Booker long list, and I should say there's probably a heavy allegedly in here, but I think there was enough evidence to say that it wasn't an alleged thing with a certain author on the list. And I remember my wrap up for the 2020 Booker Prize, I intentionally did not mention them. I don't think I did, and I felt really weird about it. And I think that's kind of the thing. But then what would have happened if they'd been shortlisted? What would have happened if they'd won? How do you not talk about that? Or is it that you talk about it but always reference the problematic element? I think that's really a really fine line, and depends on how much that conversation really needs to happen, and whether you're also the right person to have that conversation. And so that's tricky and murky ground, and I was not fully sure how I was going to approach that. So in the end, I maybe took a coward's way out in some ways. I intentionally did not mention the book, and I got it out from the library, and that was how I engaged with it. Had it made the shortlist or had it won, I probably would have had to speak about it, and I think it's sort of incumbent on us to speak about those things and call them out. But it's a tricky thing, particularly when, you know, there appears to be a lot of evidence, but it's also, I'm not really, and I don't know much about this story, and that's not necessarily an excuse, but it's, I don't know if I don't know if basically the internet needs another white guy passing his opinion on some of these things. Essentially is kind of where I was going with it. But yes, I think that's an important part actually as well, in terms of if you yourself don't feel like you're able to talk about it or have the information to or the words to, actually what do you do in terms of uplifting other people who do talk about it? And that's what I think is really important about what Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot have done with this tag, in terms of actually what do we as a community do when this happens? Do we have people who we're going to sort of turn to and maybe uplift a little bit if that's what's needed? Prompt 6, I'm really jumping around these in a very weird order, apologies. What books or authors, if any, that you would have otherwise read, do you boycott? And I mean, I've already mentioned the name of a certain British children's author / crime author / person who should stay away from Twitter. I don't think there have been too many other people who I've actively avoided, partly because it's actually not come up as such, as in many of the authors I read, as far as I'm aware, there haven't been as many controversies around. And I think I will naturally gravitate away from authors where that's been a thing that's come up, because there are so many other books out there and so many other authors, and why would I waste my time supporting people who would actively see humans have some kind of form of harm, particularly people who are near and dear to me. I mean, not that that should necessarily matter, but that yeah, it's tricky. But I think as a result, this came up a bit recently with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's book, well, her as an author, and I read her book Notes on Grief recently and loved it. And it was only after I finished it that I heard some of the controversy around Adichie. I don't think I necessarily know enough to go into it. I'll link to some sort of articles that talk about it a bit. But I think the thing I find quite tricky about this is very much two people, both, you know, kind of sort of arguing over sort of various things, and it seems to be a lot of personal drama on top of some interesting opinions. But it has sort of soured the taste of that, which is, you know, this is probably, you know, like I was saying with J.K. Rowling, you know, to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's, you know, Adichie's work, I've read 2 of her novels before, Purple Hibiscus and Half of a Yellow Sun, both of which I adored. I read Notes on Grief, which I thought was incredible. And now it's interesting for me because I'm not quite sure how much I can separate that. I still have such fond memories of those books, but it's tricky because if the kind of what's kind of coming out is true, and you know, it kind of sours it for me. So I think taking my lead again from Gunpowder fiction and plot. Why is that hard? I think I'm just sort of going to take a bit of space away from that author for a while. I mean, I didn't have any plans to, I didn't have any other sort of Adichie books on my TBR kind of coming up anytime soon, mostly because I'm still in booker mode. So that's not necessarily an issue, but it's kind of something for me to kind of, it's basically a thing for future Bob to have a little bit of a think of. I think about, you know, when this comes up, when I'm sort of presented with the next book to read, I kind of want to have a think about where I sit in all of this. Prompt 9 is a really interesting one. Do you apply the same standards to the booktubers you watch? And I think, again, Gunpowder, fiction and plot, I have to say this really slowly, said this really interesting thing here, which was a bit that actually there's a little, because of sort of you're slightly closer in some ways as a bit of a community, there's a bit more of an opportunity for calling in instead of calling out. And I think this is a critical difference. This is something that I found a bit when I was a teacher and sort of found a bit in sort of other bits of my career, I guess, about the idea of calling in. And I really like this concept, that instead of kind of saying you're wrong, blah, 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 Brené Brown again kind of talks about this. Calling in is very much like, hey, sorry, let's have a quick conversation. So actually this thing that you did here, sort of often this conversation being somewhat private. Hey, this thing that you did here was not okay for these reasons. I think, you know, just be careful around this. But that only goes so far, because that only, I guess, works if the person is really willing to be called in and or to change their actions, right? There's no point kind of being like, yeah, let's call someone in, and then the next day they go and do the exact same thing, willfully, causing harm. I think, you know, that's where it's tricky. But I think that's my natural inclination, to want to kind of be like, hey, quiet word, here's the thing. And by all means, I also want that to be in some ways the way that I'm approached with things like this. I don't actively mean harm, and so if I've misspoken, if I've misgendered someone, for example, accidentally, of course that's wrong and that can cause harm. But hopefully I'd hope that people would also sort of approach me and say, actually, Bob, sorry, this person goes by these pronouns, please respect that, please make that right in future, and you know, and please sort of reach out to do some kind of reparation in some form. I would hope for that, and I think that often feels like the best way. However, when you get somebody who, you know, and not to kind of keep hammering on J.K. Rowling here, but you know, when she was, some people very politely challenged her. And I think often gave her more politeness than was perhaps merited given her vitriol, but people, you know, actively tried reaching out and saying, hey, sorry, did you mean to say this? Or you do realize when you say this, X happens, or it sounds like this to, you know, it harms this set of people. That was often ignored. And I think that's where it becomes a real issue, because that person has clearly shown that they are not willing to kind of learn from mistakes or appreciate the harm that they can potentially enact on other people. And that's, for me, the critical difference. Is the person willing to learn? If so, we can call them in. If this person is really refusing to be called in and have any kind of conversation or dialogue about this, really, what else is going to happen here? You know, this is sort of a time to either eject or to kind of, you know, potentially kind of make it a bit more known to people, perhaps, that, you know, this is going on. I realise as well, I'm saying all of this as a middle-class white man in England, and there's a certain amount of privilege that I carry where I probably can feel a bit more comfortable with the idea of calling in, because it's not often my identity or my right to exist that's called into question or actively challenged or denied or dismissed. And so it's a lot easier for me to kind of imagine that that's a nice, happy, wonderful world where everyone, you can just have a polite conversation and they'll do it. Sometimes, you know, people are not willing to hear that, and that's a really critical difference. So with all that said, I think this comes to this final prompt, which is such a lovely one, and I think such an empathetic and brilliant way to end this, by Gunpowder, fiction and plot. And that is prompt number 10. If cancel culture is a destructive force, a constructive force might be to highlight talented authors and excellent books from communities victimized by anybody you boycott. Please highlight some authors and recommend us some books. So I think, particularly as I've spoken a bit more about transphobia on this one, I think some fantastic trans authors who are well worth checking out are Tori Peters with Detransition Baby. Again, I talk about this book all the time, well worth it, and a really great insight into, you know, written by a trans woman, talking about trans women, really insightful. There are some gorgeous and powerful and painful moments in this book, and I think it bears witness to an experience in such a gorgeous way, an experience that I have not myself shared, but have learned a lot from this book. I think it's so brilliantly done. I think Kevin Cantor's this is now where I forget it, I'll put it on the screen, a collection of poetry, Kevin Cantor being non-binary, and their writing about some of about their experience of being a non-binary person, experiencing abuse, navigating their identity especially within family expectations. I think Please Come Off Book, I want to say it's called, is brilliant, and I just thought was such an interesting collection. You've also got Sorrowland by River Solomon, and they write so beautifully and powerfully in this kind of fantasy, sci-fi kind of world. And I just think it's so well done, and exactly the kind of book that I was not expecting to love so much, but absolutely fell into and just thought was really stunningly done. I also think there are some other great authors and collections. So Trans Britain by Juliette Jacques. Sean Fay has got a book coming out this year talking about being trans. Paris Lee's What It Feels Like for a Girl, a memoir of being a trans woman growing up in a sort of working class community, and kind of her navigating her identity. I just thought was really clever. Maybe that is it for now. I will think of more, and I'll probably put them in the description below. Please also recommend some other fantastic trans authors. There are many out there, and they often don't get the love and the kind of platform that they deserve. So please do so. Thank you. I hope what I've said vaguely makes sense. I'm probably going to look back over all of this during editing and think, Bob, you are an idiot, or this is a really silly, you've not expressed yourself well at all. But let's see, and let's go from there. But thank you, and thank you again, Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, for encouraging people to have this conversation. I think it's really vital and really powerful, especially people who spend a lot of time in other worlds, you know, in books. It's so important that we think about what we learn and take away from those worlds, and what we also bring into those worlds ourselves. So thank you, and take care. Have a wonderful day, everybody.